People on the internet are comparing this episode of Lovecraft Country to Indiana Jones and National Treasure, but I think they're missing the most obvious comparison, which is Night at the Museum. Now, hear me out. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to defend that comparison. But, jokes aside, this was an interesting episode of Lovecraft Country. Very lighthearted for the most part, tonally, and without a lot of the racial tension that was in the first episode, and even in last episode to a lesser extent. But sometimes I think it's good just to have a romp, and I was glad that this show wasn't going to be all darkness anyway. Not very Lovecraftian, though, but before I get into my specific thoughts on this episode, if you're new to the channel, I'm Drew, by the way. Normally this would be coming out sooner, but the holiday weekend kept me pretty busy, so ended up not getting around to seeing the episode until just now. And I'm going to give my thoughts in just a second with spoilers, so if you don't want spoilers, come back after you've seen the episode. But before I give my specific thoughts, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I'm going to be doing reviews of upcoming shows and movies, including Woke, The Third Day, and The Devil All the Time. And if you want to see any of those reviews, as I said, please consider subscribing, and if you give me a like, I'd appreciate it. So, getting into this episode of Lovecraft Country. As I said, I don't think the tone was very Lovecraftian. Lovecraft was always about this world beneath the surface of the world that we live in, that once we have it revealed to us, we typically go insane because we realize how insignificant we are in the universe. And this episode really was too lighthearted for that, and that's, I think if you were a Lovecraft purist, you probably hate this show anyway, but the earlier episodes, you could at least see glimmers of Lovecraftian themes. This was really, as Jurnee Smollett Bell told the episode's director, Victoria Mahoney, this is really Goonies and Indiana Jones for black folks. And I think that it's easy for someone in my shoes to sit here and undervalue how special that makes this episode, because it's easy for me to think, well, everything here is rather routine, but it's not if you've never seen someone that looked like you be the star of this type of story. And, that doesn't make this perfect. I think there's definitely a lot of things that stood out to me as being not as good as they could have been, but I think that part of me needs to realize that while I am a viewer of this show, that I am not the ideal viewer of this show, in the sense that everybody has this ideal viewer in mind when they write a book or when they direct a movie. And in this case, there's probably a lot of nuance that I'm just going to miss because I'm not the ideal viewer. It wasn't entirely made with me in mind. It doesn't mean that I can't critique it. It just means that I have to realize that it's not necessarily, I'm not the ideal viewer entirely, so there's going to be things that slip by me, and I need to appreciate that as I weigh in. But overall, I did enjoy this episode. I felt, though, that there were a lot of things that I kind of felt took me out of the moment. For instance, there was a lot of casual danger dialogue, which is a trope where characters, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll go ahead and explain it, where characters are in a dangerous situation and they're basically having casual dialogue and, having conversations that could definitely wait until later. And there was a ton of that this episode. And some of these scenes were great. I particularly thought that the scene with Montrose and Atticus, where Montrose told him, basically how to handle situations where his woman is angry, I felt like that was just a beautiful bit of dialogue. Wonderful, wonderful scene. Michael K. Williams was a treasure this episode. More on him in a bit. But, of course, as I said, this seemed like a conversation they probably would have saved for later. Really, I think the MVP was Michael K. Williams. I am so glad they put him in this show. I felt like he did Harrison Ford level acting during the scenes going into the crypt. And there were some homages to Indiana Jones and to other, adventure type movies. But really, for me, for the most part, this just felt a lot like a video game. There were just the traps and the booby traps and the obstacles that they had to navigate. They never really had me too worried for the characters, which is understandable. You kind of know in the 4th episode of a 10-episode series that the characters probably aren't going to get taken out by a booby trap. But I think that what really made these sequences entertaining for me was Michael K. Williams' acting. I just felt that every scene, whether it was when he burst up out of the water in the elevator after they came up out of the water, or when he was just reacting to the fact that he was going to have to jump across that chasm, I just was really impressed by his acting. And he had a lot of acting to do this episode, but it was impressive to me that he put so much effort into the action sequences, because I wasn't expecting that, and he really stole the show from Jonathan Majors and Jurnee Smollett during these scenes, in my opinion. Just because he had very realistic and very frightened reactions. He didn't vogue at all. He didn't try to act like an action hero. He just acted like a normal person would in these situations, which is honestly what makes actors really make an impression, is when they manage to act like a real person would during an action sequence. It really heightens the levels of drama and danger. So I was super impressed by that, and that was easily the best thing about all those sequences in the crypt. He also, as I said, had some great sequences. There was a really good conversation between him and Tick at the end of the episode where they just connected, and there were some quieter moments with him and Tick earlier in the episode, and I'm really, really enjoying this father-son dynamic. I'm a sucker for father-son relationships, and I think this is a particularly well-developed one. I think I actually am more interested in this relationship than I am in the relationship between Tick and Letitia. But that's neither here nor there. Very well done. The episode ended on a shocking cliffhanger. Michael K. Williams, Montrose, obviously is trying to protect Tick from his heritage, from this magical realm that he is kind of unwittingly going to be embroiled in. And in order to protect him further, he goes so far as to murder Yahima, which some people pointed out was kind of a strange decision, given that this character was, another representative of a very marginalized group. And I felt like it was particularly concerning, given that we're already dealing with, they had discussions this episode about how Tick had to grapple with his ancestors' crimes against Yahima and her people. So to have Montrose murder her, it's a very, very shocking moment, and it kind of goes against tonally a lot of the other stuff that they were doing with Montrose this episode. It's going to be hard to go back and laugh at the sequences of him during the hijinks in the crypt when you realize that this episode leads to him committing a murder. But moving on, there were a couple other noteworthy things this episode that hint where the show is going to go in future episodes based on the book, which I just returned to the library. Pretty decent read if you don't mind spoiling the show for yourself a bit. They're not completely the same, obviously. But we got to see this interesting situation develop with Ruby this episode, and I really was impressed by Wunmi Mosaku's performance. She is actually one of my favorite characters in this show, and it was interesting because her dream, is to work at this store, to be this clerk at this store. And the way this scene developed, where you see her walk in and she's, looking to apply and to get this job, and that's her dream. And it's just such a small dream, but that this is ruined for her. And my initial reaction, and this is me, not having lived in a person like Ruby's shoes, that I was like, well, it was good of them to hire one black woman. And then it occurred to me, there's no reason that they couldn't hire two of them. And Ruby drew attention to this later in the episode, is that there's 103 people in this store, but they can only hire one black woman because that's the limit of what they're willing to do. And just the subtle evil of that it's something where, the best person should be able to get the job. And not necessarily saying that Ruby deserves this job, but she deserves a chance to get this job, and that she's deprived even that chance, and that there can only be one black woman at this store. It's just a very, very subtle wrong, and it's the type of thing that, black people in America have been dealing with for a very long time, and even today continue to deal with, shockingly. I've grown up thinking that a lot of these things have gone away, but it's very much evident that they haven't. And just the sadness that she feels in the way that she portrays that was very well done. Now, they did a good job of not letting her be too mopey. I think that even when characters are wronged in television, we don't like to see them sit around bemoaning their fate too long. And she got things on with William very quickly. Now, what his agenda is remains to be seen, but we have to imagine that while he's been portrayed as a rather decent fellow so far, we haven't really seen him do anything bad. He's certainly part of Christina Braithwaite's plans, and he's her accomplice, so we really shouldn't trust him farther than we can throw him. So it's going to be interesting to see. I have some insight where this plot line is going because of the book, but I'm not going to spoil it for people who have not read the book. But let's just say it's going to be interesting, and I'm not sure how the show is going to portray this, because there's going to be... Let's just say that it's going to be complicated. I'm not sure how they're going to portray it. I have some theories, but I'm not going to throw those out yet. We also got to see Hippolyta along for the ride at the museum, and we learned how she had the idea for the name of this meteor, and that was taken from her because of the color of her skin. So another subtle example of, not necessarily a life or death evil of racism, but something where she's not afforded the same rights and privileges that other people have. And I'm interested to see, there's going to be a Hippolyta-centered episode later. I'm interested to see, because I'm enjoying Aunjanue Ellis's performance, and I think that the episode is going to be one of the more interesting episodes of the season, personally, based on what happens in the book. So I'm excited for that episode. And it's good that they're kind of doing some of the groundwork for the episodes to come in this episode instead of just doing all the work in one episode. So it's kind of towing the line between episodic and serialized a little bit. So overall, good episode. I personally didn't think it was a great episode, but I understand there's probably a lot of nuance that I'm missing. The soundtrack was fantastic. There's a lot of buoyancy to the way this episode happened. I didn't find this episode boring at all. I thought it had humor, and it kept things lighthearted and fun the whole time, which was kind of an odd decision tonally. But, it worked. I think that the biggest question I have is how this is going to work for people on a week-to-week basis who... I'm really, really flexible with my entertainment. Like, I'll watch a lot of different things. But if you came here for Lovecraftian horror and this is what you got this week, I'm not sure how you would feel about it. So, those are just my thoughts for what they're worth. If you're interested in seeing more reviews on this channel, I do weekly reviews of Lovecraft Country, Raised by Wolves, and The Boys, and other shows as they come out. If you're interested in seeing any of those reviews, please consider subscribing so that you can see them as they come out on a weekly basis. If you give me a like, I'd really appreciate it. And as always, you can watch more videos right now.